Good day. Before I do this further program, which will be, as always, a update on the current international crisis, which centers on Ukraine, this is just to remind you that if you're watching any of our videos on YouTube, on Rumble, and that means videos produced by the Duran, Alexander Mercouris, and Alex Christoforou. If you go to the top of the video and see a red maroon button there, and if you press that button, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can join our thriving and active community. If you choose to become an active member, you can publish your own exclusive content, and you can also participate in my live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Well, situation in Ukraine remains, as always, subject to lots of contradictory pieces of information. But I would repeat, in terms of the military situation, what I said in my previous video. The fog of war, or so it seems to me, has slightly lifted, and we're able to get a more reasonable picture of what is going on. We have an ongoing struggle between the two conflict parties over control of the important city of Mariupol, which is located on the Sea of Azov, and also a similarly complex struggle much further north, where the Russians and their militia allies seem to be tightening their control around the important Ukrainian grouping centered around the city of Severodonetsk. One of the odd things that happened is that over the previous day, there were reports, I can't confirm these, that the Ukrainians announced or were intending to launch a major counteroffensive on their various fronts over the course of yesterday. Well, if that is so, then clearly that offensive or counteroffensive never got off the ground. It seems, if anything, that it failed. So it seems that the situation on the ground is much as before in terms of a counteroffensive that has failed, but of a tightening grip by the Russians and their allies over Mariupol, which some reports say may be about to fall within the next couple of hours. I'm not able to confirm that. And a similar situation further north in Severodonetsk. There has been one other piece of information which I do find strange, but which does seem to be perhaps true, which is that the Ukrainians, far from trying to pull their troops back from Donbass, as apparently they've been urged to do by various parties, have instead been trying to reinforce them. I'm not so much referring to the troops in Mariupol, who are completely encircled, and the troops in Severodonetsk, who are largely encircled, but another grouping of the Ukrainian forces opposite the major city of Donetsk. And I have to say, I do find that strange, because again, if you look at the operational maps, to the extent to which they are reliable, it's clear that this grouping of Ukrainian troops is at real risk now of encirclement also. So sending more reinforcements to it seems to me to be sending troops and material into what is in effect a trap. Now, I wonder whether that is really happening, and if so, why? And I'm going to make a guess. If it is happening, and I want to stress this is purely a guess, I am going to guess that it is connected to the progress of the negotiations. The Russians have made a number of demands over the course of their negotiations with Ukraine. The first is that Ukraine accept neutral status. Ukraine has publicly all but done that, but there is still apparently much to do to sort out what that means in practice. The second demand is that Ukraine demilitarize, and again there's a lot of discussion as to what that means. And the third is that it also carry out a comprehensive cleansing of its political system, of the various radical ultra-right groups that the Russians so strongly object to. There is, however, a further demand that the Russians are making, which is that Ukraine formally recognize that Crimea is now part of Russia, and that the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and their regions have become independent of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians at the moment are strongly resisting the last demand, the latter demand. And I wonder whether, if it is indeed the case that the Ukrainians are trying to reinforce their forces in the Donbass, even at the risk of encirclement, whether the reason is that they want to maintain some kind of military presence in Donbass, so that when they negotiate with the Russians, they're able to say that, in fact, Donbass is still Ukrainian because they have their troops there. If that's the case, then, as I said, it seems to me a mistaken strategy. And I wonder whether that reshuffle of commanders, which I discussed a few days ago and which the Ukrainians have carried out, reassigning the commander of the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine to Kiev and replacing him with his deputy, whether that might be because this particular general, this previous commander, was unhappy with this strategy and felt that it made no military logic and was anxious to get his troops out of the cauldron of eastern Ukraine, and was becoming frustrated that the political leadership in Kiev was not proceeding to give him those orders. Well, I want to stress that's purely a guess. I have no way of knowing one way or the other whether that is true. I'm not informed about internal debates or discussions within Ukraine or indeed within Russia, so I don't know what the actual situation is. But I repeat again something which I've said in many programs. It is a genuine puzzle to me that so much of the commentary in the West remains focused on what's going on in and around Kiev, where in fact there appears to me to be very little fighting, and in and around Kharkiv, where also there appears to be very little fighting, and seems to be completely uninterested in what is going on in the east, in Donbass, where this war is actually being fought, and fought very intensively, and is being decided. I would add that we're getting all kinds of extraordinary reports. Both the American and British defense ministries, for example, like to say that the Russian advance is stalled. Well, given that Mariupol is closely invested, as Severodonetsk also is, I can't see that that is something one can honestly say. And the US Department of Defense has come up with an extraordinary claim that 7,000 Russian soldiers have been killed over the course of the recent fighting. I place no credence on that claim whatsoever. I remember that during the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the US made similar inflated claims about the level of Soviet casualties, which it turned out it had been exaggerating by many orders of magnitude. And I expect the same is true in this case. Anyway, the two leaders of the two respective combatant countries have been making speeches. The first, obviously, is a speech that President Zelensky made to the US Congress, in which he appeared also to ask again for a no-fly zone, or in the alternative, for some kind of aerial assistance to defeat the Russian Air Force. The response from the US government was to provide Ukraine with more anti-tank missiles, more Stinger and manpads, that's handheld anti-aircraft missiles, and also kamikaze drones, fairly small. They can be apparently carried by a single soldier, so we're not talking about the very sophisticated and advanced American Reaper drones or anything like that. kamikaze drones, which can be used apparently to attack Russian troops and installations. I don't think anybody who has followed this conflict in any detail thinks that these supplies are going to make any real difference to the battle. I have to say, despite the big number in terms of dollars, $800 million that's been cited for this aid package, it looks to me a fairly token affair, and I'm increasingly coming round to the view that all these urgent demands from Ukraine, supported by some of Ukraine's East European allies for military support, are being rejected by the major Western powers. The German government in particular, which is looking, I think, increasingly queasy about what it has got itself into as a result of the sanctions packages that it signed up to. The German government has categorically ruled any direct military involvement in the Ukrainian conflict out. So that was Zelensky speaking to the US Congress. He's also, by the way, spoken to the Canadian Parliament and to the Bundestag, saying, I think, fairly similar things. He was extremely critical of German economic engagement with Russia in his speech to the Bundestag. I wonder what the Germans made of that. But anyway, to continue, Putin also made a very important speech, in my opinion, a much more important speech than Zelensky's, because Putin has been somewhat reticent in some of the things he's been saying since the conflict, but he did make a very interesting speech, and I provided a link under this video. He basically said that the military operation is proceeding much as planned. He also provided an explanation as to why it extended beyond the Donbass. He said that limiting this operation exclusively to the Donbass would simply have moved the line of contact further west. The Ukrainians would have continued to conduct operations against the Donbass and against the Russian troops unimpeded from the further point of the westward line of contact, so that what the Russians have done by going deeper into Ukraine is that they're seeking to engineer a solution to this conflict which will be total and lasting. And of course, that's what the negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians are all about. Now, I would say that the Financial Times yesterday published a story about a peace plan, a 15-point peace plan, which had supposedly been drawn up and which the two sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, were allegedly close to signing. It would have been one which would have declared Ukraine's neutral status and would have made provisions for the speaking of the Russian language in Ukraine, and for restrictions, as far as I can see, on the scale of the Ukrainian military. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have said that the Financial Times went much too far in its reporting. Both have said that this plan, this so-called draft plan, is either just a point of discussion or doesn't really even exist at all. And both of them have indicated that the discussions are essentially close to deadlock. And I understand that Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, has again warned the Ukrainians that unless they come to terms with the Russians soon, the risk they run is that the Russians will instead, at some point, up their demands and demand Ukraine's total surrender, presumably some form of unconditional surrender, and will then execute on that when they're in a position to do so. Well, that's apparently what Lukashenko said. So it seems to me negotiations at the moment still ongoing, proving to be very slow, as might be expected. Ideas about neutrality being floated around, but no breakthrough yet. And a military situation which in eastern Ukraine is looking increasingly difficult for the Ukrainian side, despite some claims that have been made on Ukraine's behalf by its Western allies, the United States and Britain, and by, of course, the Ukrainians themselves. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about Putin's explanation for the conduct of the Russian military campaign. But Putin, of course, also had a lot of other things that he also wanted to say. He talked extensively about the sanctions war that the United States and its allies in the West, the collective West, as the Russians have now taken to calling it, are directing against Russia. And he made it very clear that, so far as he's concerned, this is a long-standing plan. This was very much a plan that was intended to break the Russian economy and to return Russia, in effect, to the position it was in the 1990s, when its economy was essentially broken and run by the West to the extent that it functioned at all, and when Russia had lost all ability to take decisions by itself. And he rather interestingly suggested that the sanctions war has taken three lines. The first was the financial sanctions, the sanctions against the Russian central bank, the disconnection of certain Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank messaging system. And he effectively said that these sanctions, which were intended, according to him, to disrupt or destabilize the Russian financial system, that those sanctions have failed, and that the Russian financial system has withstood the challenge and continues to function normally within Russia, that it's been able to meet all the requirements that it is subjected to, and for that reason it's been able to function properly. So that's what Putin said was the first major push against the Russians. The second was the oil ban, which it's clear now, I think it's increasingly clear, has not actually worked out quite as intended. It's not been anywhere near as complete as the US perhaps, or at least the authors of it, initially intended, and it's become permeable. And in fact, I'm even getting reports that for the moment at least, Russian oil is still being supplied to the United States. Apparently, it's oil that was largely ordered before the sanctions were imposed, and there is a window before the final guillotine comes down. But I've even received a report that it would in theory still be possible for American refineries to buy Russian oil through middlemen. The one thing that they're not able to do is to buy it directly from Russia. I can't confirm that, by the way. The third sanctions, or series of sanctions that Putin mentioned, and by the way, they're not actually sanctions, but he sort of implied that they've been orchestrated, is to get Western companies to pull out of Russia, to stop deliveries of spares and components to Russia in order to create material goods shortages there. But again, he seemed to think that the Russians, after a period of instability, which could lead to higher inflation and more unemployment, but both within controllable limits, he seemed to think that this would be only a temporary phenomenon. He didn't say for how long, but he seemed to believe that the Russians would be able to overcome those problems too, relying both on their own resources and those of their foreign partners, their major foreign trade partners, of which obviously at the moment the most important is China, but India is also an important player as well. So that's where I think we are at the moment with what Putin said. Most important point he made for me is that he said that the financial situation in Russia is stable, that Russia is not short of money, that it can continue to fund all its programs, and indeed even increase funding where needed, without having to resort to the printing press, so that there is no danger of hyperinflation or of anything like that. So overall, I thought that he gave a fairly upbeat assessment of how Russia is withstanding the sanctions pressure. So there we go. It was quite clear to me from Putin's comments that he intends to see this military operation in Ukraine through. And given what he said about not allowing another front line to develop in Ukraine, I have to say that I'm increasingly coming to the view, as I think many others are, that despite the fact that the Russians, for the moment, still insist that they're not pursuing or seeking regime change in Ukraine, I still get the sense that the Russians, or at least Putin, want such a fundamental restructuring of the situation in Ukraine that realistically they're not going to leave Ukraine anytime soon. I say that because if he really doesn't want new conflict lines to emerge, and if he wants any agreement he makes or finally forces upon Ukraine to stick, then some form of Russian boots on the ground, at least for a time, seem to me to be essential. And the fact that apparently in the areas of southeastern Ukraine, which have now fallen securely under Russian control, the Russians have now been starting to take steps to set up parallel administrations in replacement of the Ukrainian ones, also to my mind points to something that increasingly looks like a permanent presence. Indeed, I'm going to say this straightforwardly. I wonder whether the days of independent Ukraine, as we have known them, are actually now becoming increasingly numbered. I have to say that the underlying logic of this looks to me like we're heading increasingly towards some kind of resolution in which the Russians are not merely looking for an end to the conflict in the Donbass, but an end to the conflict in Ukraine, or rather the crisis in Ukraine that has existed, arguably ever since the Soviet Union broke up, a resolution of that conflict once and for all. Anyway, there we are. We will see what comes. The only thing I will say, and I will say it again, is this. I think that there is a game underway to try to keep these negotiations between Russia and Ukraine prolonged indefinitely. I think that there are some ideas about bleeding the Russians dry in Ukraine. I think all of this is based on profoundly wrong and incorrect information. I think that if one is talking about the situation in Kiev and Kharkiv, where the Western focus appears to be, my overall view is that there's actually very little fighting going on in these places. The major fighting is in Donbass, and the Ukrainians are clearly losing it. And I think that so far from time being on the Ukrainian side, I think on the contrary, the longer the Ukrainians hold out, the more difficult the terms they will have to accept will be. I wonder whether this is understood in Kiev. I wonder whether this is understood in Washington and London and in Brussels. But it seems to me that anybody who really is concerned about Ukraine ought instead to be urging the Ukrainians to settle as soon as possible. Now, shortly before I made this program, I should say that there's been further news that President Biden is going to talk to the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. Apparently, it's going to be another discussion about managing the competition between these two powerful countries, the United States and China, though obviously Ukraine will also be a topic that will be discussed. The Chinese media over the course of the last week has been steadily hardening its position on Ukraine. It's been making it increasingly clear that the Chinese are not prepared to bend to US demands on this issue. So I don't know what the Americans hope to achieve. It would not be unusual, I have to say, for the Americans, having got nowhere in the course of an intense conversation, the intense conversation that took place between Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and Yang Jiechi, Xi Jinping's national security advisor, in Rome on Monday. It would not be unlike the Americans to make one last effort to bend the Chinese to their thinking by talking directly president to president. But I have to say, I think that Xi Jinping is going to give no more ground to the Americans than Yang Jiechi did to Sullivan in Rome on Monday. But anyway, regardless of that, we will no doubt find out more tomorrow, and obviously I shall keep you informed, and of course I shall also keep you informed to the best that I can about the situation on the ground, where it is increasingly looking as if dramatic events may be about to unroll, especially in Mariupol. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. In the meantime, just to remind you again that you can find us on Rumble and on various other platforms, and as well as, of course, locals. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, where you'll find all sorts of wonderful things. And of course, you can support us also by ticking this like button to this video and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.